Good afternoon, everyone. I'm really excited to be here to present my joint work with Marcus Pearce on shared expectancy dynamics in melodic phrases from across the world. So let's get started. In recent years, there's been a renewed interest in so-called musical universals. Back in 2013, Brown and Jordania suggested about 70 potential universals, as far as I remember, and Pat Savage and colleagues have then later on confirmed that 18 of these are indeed present widely cross-culturally across cultures and around the world. They refer to those as statistical universals because they're not universally present everywhere, but they're very prominent across cultures. And another strand of research led by Mehr and others has focused on the functions of music, showing, for example, that lullabies, dance songs, healing songs, and so on are recognized cross-culturally by listeners from other cultures. So this work on musical universals, I think you can say that there's been a focus on function and context over structure. So if you look at the 18 universals over here, for instance, you see that only a few of them deal with actual structure. Many of them deal with male performers, group performance, the performance context. The universals that do relate to structure, there's a focus on global over local features. So for instance, properties of the scale, properties of the metric system, and so on, over more precise characteristics of the local musical context. Also a focus on what over why. So what are the actual universal features rather than where do they come from and why are they like they are. So there's a focus on surface features rather than a deeper cognitive structure, and I'll get to why that is important. Good. So if we take a look at one of the typical potential universals often talked about, descending melodic lines or arched contour at the phrase level. This work was pioneered by David Huron back in the mid 90s in a paper where he first devised 9 contour types. So if you look at the first note and the last note in phrase, and then take the average of all the intervening notes, that gives you kind of 3 points, and the relationship with those then relate to these 9 contour types. So some phrases can be ascending, descending, convex, concave, and different combinations of horizontal and all of these trajectories. Of course, the horizontal constraint is a strong one, so that means that most of our phrases are going to end up in these 4 categories. What he did then is that he looked at the pitch contours in about 6,000, mostly German folk songs from the Essen folk song collection, and he analyzed these at 3 levels. At the single phrase level, so assigning all of these individual phrases to these 9 categories. At the aggregate level, so if you take, for instance, all the melodies that are 8 notes long with cardinality 8, and you take what is the average pitch of the first note, average pitch of the second, third, and so on, and you get this arch contour that you see down here. And then the third level is at the phrase level. So if you take the average of the different phrases of a melody, you get a similar arch pattern as well. So this is what is referred to as the melodic arch, very prominent in German folk songs. Of course, there's been some criticism of the Essen folk song collection, most recently expressed by Andrew Brinkman, for instance. He asked whether we can truly believe that this is really German music. Of course, you can ask what was Germany in the 19th century anyway. Germany is perhaps a more recent idea. Also, there's some dispute about whether these are complete and accurate representations of the primary sources. So when they were collected into the Essen folk song collection, were they actually true to what the original sources said, and also when they were digitized, were they representative? Good. Then there's also been talk that there's an overrepresentation of vocal music. And there are a number of issues that are not specified in the primary sources. So for instance, there's a genre classification that has been added later on. Geographic locations are not necessarily super accurate. And then most importantly for us here, the phrase markings were added later on. I don't think this is probably not much of an issue here because we can believe that phrase markings are mostly agreed upon by different people, but it isn't definitely something to keep in mind. Good, so universality claims here require a cross-cultural evidence beyond just Germanic folk songs. So the most important issue here is, of course, that we need to extend and replicate this work beyond Western or beyond German folk songs, in fact. And the only replication that I'm aware of is a number of studies on Western pop music. So we're still within the same culture. So there's potential to work on this, which is what we've done here. So we first decided to replicate Huron's analysis using the Essen folk song collection. Then we extended this with the Chinese subset of the Essen folk song collection, which is about half the size or so. And then finally, a Native American folk song collection collected by Francis Densmore. Good. So if we look at the distribution of phrase lengths here, we see that there's indeed some difference here. Chinese folk songs tend to be longer, have longer phrases. Native American folk songs tend to have shorter phrases than the German folk songs. So it seems relevant here to apply a certain minimum criterion. So when we do these aggregate melody analysis, it's important that we have a critical mass of phrases within each cardinality. So we decided to focus on 500 here. So focus on the cardinalities where we have at least 500 phrases. Good. So art shapes in German folk songs. Well, here are the aggregates that I talked about before. So you take, for instance, all the melodies that are 13 notes long, and then you take the average of the first, second, third, and so on. But you also have the individual data here as well. And you can see that for all of them, with the exceptions of cardinality 2 and 4, they're all convex in shape. Of course, in the high and low cardinalities here, you have very few phrases, and therefore you see some deviations from this, but still very, very strong arch shape contours. Good. So this is just another plot showing the same things for the different cardinalities. All of them almost are convex in shape. And if you look at individual phrases, you also see here that arch shapes are much more common than the other types. In the second place, you have the descending contours, and then the ascending contours, and then finally the concave ones. Good. So that was German folk songs. What happens with the Chinese folk songs? What's interesting here is that you get a very different pattern here in the contours. So instead of an inverted U shape, you get an inverted J shape. And if you look at the aggregate level, and if you look at the individual phrases, you get descending pitch contours much more commonly than you get arch shapes. And if you look at Native Americans, this tendency becomes even stronger. So there's an even higher prominence of descending pitch contours rather than arch shapes at both analytical levels. This suggests that descending contours are much more prominent than convex in Chinese and Native American. That, of course, questions whether we can really talk about this as universal. We probably shouldn't. So in this connection, I would like to draw your attention to the keynote talk later today by David Huron, where, if I understood correctly, he will present some of the results from a study we did when I was a postdoc in his lab a few years ago, where we transcribed about 700 initial and final phrases from a very diverse set of field recordings by the Smithsonian Folkways and Ancora Radio France record labels. And in this analysis, we also found no universal arch shapes. So the evidence here is converging against pitch contour arch shapes as a universal. So let's take a step back here and think a bit about what are universals really. And of course, universality status necessitates some cross-cultural prominence, as we've talked about. If these are to be stable across time and cultures, they require rooting in durable aspects of human mind and body. So following Henke and Honin's point, then when we study the evolution of music, we should study the evolution of musicality rather than the evolution of music. And following this idea, I think it could make sense to study universals of musicality rather than universals of music itself. So if you have certain embodied constraints, they lead to different surface features that can differ between different cultures. So these surface features are statistical, as Pat Savage work and work by others shows, but actually these embodied constraints could have more of a absolute universal status. Good, so let's look at some examples. So first of all, what kind of embodied constraints could we have here? If we think about physiology, we know, for instance, that throughout the a phrase, we lose air, so we get declining subglossal pressure, which makes it harder to sing high pitches. So that on the overall level should lead to interphrasal pitch declination. We also need to breathe, of course, and that could mean lead to greater lengthening or pausing at the end of phrases. And we have limited muscle agility. It takes more energy to vary your pitch a lot, so that creates as a tendency towards pitch proximity in musical phrases. Of course, there are also cognitive constraints here. So we know there are principles about auditory stream segregation, which also could lead to pitch proximity. So if notes are close to each other in pitch, they're more likely to be perceived as members of the same stream. Of course, our limited working memory would also correspond to these phrase final lengthening, and first of all, also to the short phrases that we have. And the physiological constraints like respiration also contributes to this. Then there's the issue of predictive segmentation. So we know more and more about how prediction informs our segmentation of stimuli around us, and that could lead to phrase final cadential closure. I will say a bit more about the rationale for this. So if it doesn't make sense now, hopefully it will in a moment. Good. So prediction as a cognitive constraint. We know that prediction is key to many, many aspects of musical behavior when we listen, when we improvise, when we compose, when we perform expressively, our motions, joint performance, when you read notation, and so on. And this applies across musical cultures. Prediction may contribute to phrase segmentation in two very different ways. So first of all, retrospectively. So once a phrase boundary has happened, you know, because the beginning of the next phrase tends to be surprising. So that's kind of your retrospective phrase segmentation. But there's also prospective phrase segmentation going on. So phrases tend to end on high uncertainty notes, as we'll see, and that gives you some cue about the fact that a phrase boundary is about to happen. And these can be operationalized by information theory in terms of information content for surprise. So that's kind of the reverse probability, you could say. And for uncertainty, we have entropy, which tells you something about the uncertainty about what is about to happen rather than what just happened. Good. So so yeah, retrospectively, melodic phrase boundaries are perceived before surprising notes, as I said. And also work by Pearce, Müllensiefen, and Wiggins showed that expectation-based models perform comparably to rule-based surface feature models without being supplied prior musical knowledge. So you see here that whenever pitch varies a lot, maybe that seems like a phrase boundary. That's the surface feature model, but our expectations about these movements, that's the deeper model here. Good. So when it comes to prospective cues, we showed in a paper together with Haley Kragness, Peter Woost, Laurel Trainer, and Marcus Pearce, we showed that non-musicians rate uncertain melodic endings as more complete. So no matter if we take endings that were actually phrase beginnings or phrase endings in the original corpus, entropy is what really determines people's percept of completeness. And also, if you ask them to self-pace through these melodies, they dwell longer upon them when they're higher in entropy. Good. So that leads us to our three research questions here. So what are the shared expectancy dynamics of musical phrases from across the world? And can they be characterized as universal? Secondly, what is the relative contribution of retrospective versus prospective processes? Are they both important, or can one replace the other? And finally, how do expectancy dynamics compare to melodic surface features, or what we would refer to as gestalt perception sometimes? Good. So what we did is that we used these three samples that I described before: German, Chinese, and Native American folk songs. So we have about 9,000 melodies here, 55,000 phrases, and 500,000 notes all in all. Then we applied the information dynamics of music model to estimate uncertainty and surprise for each note in this corpus. So for each note in the corpus, we knew where it was placed in the phrase, and we knew how uncertain expectations it generated for what followed, and also how surprising the note itself was. And what the model here does is that it represents music in a certain way. In this case, we represented music as a combination of pitch intervals, scale degrees, and mode. So we had separate models for minor and major melodies when this was relevant. And then it estimates uncertainty and surprise based on that. Good. So looking at some results here, for surprise first, we see both, again, an aggregate analysis for the cardinalities that have more than 500 phrases, and the individual level contour types. And this is not contour pitch contours, but this is surprise contours, very importantly. So we see that all of these very generally show decreasing surprise throughout the phrase, and the beginning of the next note in the next phrase. Phrase boundary here is marked with a dashed line. The beginning of the next phrase is high surprise. And we see this at the individual level and at the aggregate level as well. For Chinese phrases, we have a very similar pattern emerging here. You can see the distribution of individual phrases is very similar, and also they're all descending in a very similar way. And finally, for the Native American songs, we see something similar, both at the individual and aggregate level. Good. So if we do statistics comparing the information content of the next phrase, beginning of the next phrase, and the mean of the previous phrase, it is statistically significant. And also if we compare more locally, just the end of the phrase with the beginning of the next phrase, it's still very significant. So this is a retrospective cue. Once the next note, the beginning of the next note has happened, we know that a phrase has ended. Surprise can also be used prospectively. However, if we think about the surprise between the penultimate note and the final note, we see that it does decrease significantly, both when we look at the average and when we look at the local level. So melodies tend to end on unsurprising notes, and that could potentially be a cue for segmentation. Good. Looking at uncertainty, we also see very similar patterns for German and Chinese folk songs, at least. And the pattern here is that the last note in the melody generates high uncertainty about what happens next. So that gives you these concave uncertainty contour types generally. So even though these are very different musics on the surface, they have under similar underlying expectancy dynamics. There's a similar but slightly different pattern for the Native American songs here. So we do see this dominance of concave individual phrases, but at the aggregate levels, they tend to be more ascending. But we do see this increase in uncertainty for the last note. So there's a similar thing going on. We do statistics again on the it is statistically significant both compared to the mean of the phrase and to the penultimate node in the phrase. Good. So this leads us to the question about which factors best predict phrase endings. And here we did logistic regression, where we predict the presence of a phrase boundary based on these features. We see here for the first model, which is just the surface model, that it predicts about 3% or less than 1% for some of the corpora. Uncertainty change is one of the predictive features here. So the uncertainty from the last node compared to the penultimate node, and we see that we predict more variance using this. And then there's the surprise change model 3, where you look at the next, where you look at the beginning of the next phrase. So this is the retrospective cue, and then you also have the prospective surprise cue that we talked about. So the comparison between the last node and the penultimate node, which is not very predictive. So you can say overall that prediction seems to perform better than the surface features, and retrospective surprise change and prospective uncertainty change both explain unique variance. So we compare these models to each other, and we can see that they both contribute. Prospective information content change is not very predictive. However, this is our model 4. But if you look at the R-squared values here, there's still a lot of variance to explain. Good. So in conclusion, expectancy dynamics may be stronger candidates than surface features for absolute melodic universals. So they're not just statistical, but absolute here. And if you think about it, if you have a descending pitch contour, that's not going to be very informative about when the phrase ends, because it could potentially just continue going down. But the expectancy dynamics tell you that. Good. So of course we need to think about which factors can explain the remaining variance here. We could operationalize our expectancy dynamics in different ways with moving windows, for instance. It's important to realize that we explain 13% of the variance, but we haven't taken any rhythm or meter into account. So that's of course important. That can be done both at the surface and expectancy dynamics. Also, I would imagine that there are different phrase types here. So we talk about authentic and half cadences in the Western music, for instance. It's possible that there are different phrase types happening, and of course the phrase position in the overall melody. So there might be different expectancy dynamics for initial phrases and final phrases, for instance. So what is needed now? Well, I think we need further substantiation of this universality cross-culturally, and for that, very importantly, we need large collections of music that are monocultural and are symbolically encoded. So they need to be symbolically encoded in order to analyze with the idiom model. They need to be monocultural because you train the model on the corpus itself, and it makes predictions about the corpus itself. So it needs to be one culture, and it also needs to be very large. And we need it to have explicit phrase annotation, so we have a ground truth about where the phrase boundary are. So I'm really looking for other data sets of relevant collaborations here, if anyone is aware of other musics that we should be analyzing. So with that, I'll say thank you, and thanks for listening.